Well, thank you. I'm honored to participate. It's such a pleasure to be part of this presentation. As Vicki mentioned, I've written these two books. Professional and Practical Considerations for Landscape Design is intended as a book for landscape architects just coming out of school or young professionals. It gives you a tour of the main topics of the field, professional practice, how to manage projects, guide them from concept to completion, and gives you a good sense of the process you go through in doing construction. The topic of landscape architecture professional practice often gets narrowed between those who do professional practice and those who do design. And the goal of the book is to show that these topics overlap a great deal. The image you see on this first slide is the Fresh Kills Park in New York City, which is a former landfill. It's actually 3 times the size of Central Park. It's been a very complex project to bring to the state of being a park after years of landfill. The book includes beautiful illustrations by Vicki Chan, your host here, and construction details and technical drawings, surveys. So the book encompasses the whole gamut of drawings that typically landscape architects prepare. The other book, Green Roofs and Sustainable Landscape Design, was done by W.W. Norton in 2008, although it's old and includes case studies of green roofs all over North America, as well as a chapter on European origins where green roofs started, and a lot of information on planting, irrigation, specifications. So it's still a great resource if you're getting basic information about these topics. What are green roofs? They're roofs bearing vegetation in many forms, accessible or inaccessible for people, flat or sloping, handle perennials and ground covers, including sedums, and trees and shrubs. They have many environmental advantages. You often hear the topic growing medium or substrate, which I'll talk about later. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 had a major impact on that field because when it was signed by the first President Bush, it requires that buildings be accessible, and that includes roof gardens, and buildings with entrances must have an accessible entrance so that someone with disabilities can easily get into the building. So there must be one clear, accessible access to the main entrance of the buildings. So there are all sorts of criteria that are developed for ramps, landings, cross slopes. There are definitions for pavements and signage. There has to be a fit between the indoors and the outdoors. Usually it means there are 2 means of access, so that if in an emergency one is blocked off, there's an alternate access. In roof gardens and buildings, there has a focus on safety. So you have reviews by the fire department, the police department. There's compliance with code requirements such as the parapet height and structural design criteria. There's a limit in the use of flammable materials. There are criteria for dead and live loads. The dead load is the weight of the materials used to construct it, usually permanently fixed elements, while the live load is the weight added as a result of the fixed use of the space. Often you're caught up in the design to minimize weight. So you'll see paving on pedestal systems so that over a sloping roof, you can have a dead level pavement. You'll have planters with false bottoms, lightweight soil mixes, lighter metals and other materials to minimize weights. Often you need to design materials to resist wind and have resilience and strength. and concentrate load-bearing materials on piers or places where there's strong points in structural design. That might be the load-bearing walls. Here's some images of planters that have such elements. Cortens planters with interior fiberglass liners, for example. These are paving on pedestal systems and planters that can be rolled out for maintenance. They have false bottoms so that the planter level surface can be brought up to the height of the parapet, but the depth of the planter is not the full height of the planter. Drainage and grading is very important, even on a roof. You need to verify the existing drainage to disturb the existing drainage as little as possible, to provide protective covers over existing drains. One advantage of the pavers over pedestals is that you can often put utilities such as irrigation, electrical, and other systems underneath the pavement, bring drip irrigation emitters underneath them, and key into the back of the planters so they're hardly visible. Design considerations are myriad. You can focus strongly on the edges, provide adequate seating, contrast the use of shade and sun, incorporate water features, anticipate diagonal patterns of movement in order to make the spaces seem large, because often the cost is prohibitive, so you have a limited amount of space. It's important to avoid acute angles and corners in the forms of pavers and planters. And it's good to incorporate sculpture and art integral to the design. And it's important also to consider year-round use. Planning is essential. Planning should focus on architectural and structural elements first, and then decorative means. Because you have a lot of wind and severe conditions, particularly as you go higher in height, it's smart to plan for climate zones hardier than what you would use at grade. Know the client's preferences, taste, and restrictions, and the limitation of each class of plant materials that you're using. One important thing that I've found over many years of experience is that plant materials native to river environments that are prone to flooding are often hardy in urban conditions because they seem to have a means of bringing oxygen through their bark and down to the root system. For green roofs, sedums and related species like Delosperma are often used and are very hardy, but there are many other plant materials that are suitable. You don't want to use plant materials that are too large with overly aggressive root systems or that are lacking in hardiness. Starting at the upper left is prairie smoke to the right, campanula, tidy tips the lower right, and prickly pear cactus, which are four very suitable materials for extensive green roofs. Extensive green roofs are usually inaccessible. They're on a growing medium less than 15 centimeters. Plant materials are usually perennials of limited height that are very hardy and adaptable. Pure sedum roofs are a good example, but often there are other diverse plant materials. The upper right is an example in Portland, Oregon. The lower right is a warehouse in Basel, Switzerland. Intensive green roofs are usually accessible. That is, they're designed to accommodate people. The growing medium is greater than 15 centimeters, and you have a much wider variety of plant materials. There's greater structural design to accommodate the larger weight, including people. This is a hotel in Montreal. The growing medium or substrate is usually inorganic material rather than a standard topsoil. The inorganic material is useful because it doesn't decompose over time, therefore requiring replenishment over a period of time, which can be a challenge if you're having to bring materials to the roof. Typical materials are expanded shell, clay, crushed brick, volcanic material. A small amount of organic material can sometimes be mixed in. The green roof manufacturers now, such as Zanco, Octogru, and there are many others, provide you a sandwich of layers, and that can include even the choice of plant materials, starting with the roof deck and vapor barriers extending all the way to the plant materials. Often there's a capacity to store water within the system. An important resource is the FLL based in Europe, which has done extensive testing on green roof materials, including waterproofing, roofing, plant materials. It's been translated into English every 3 to 5 years, and it's a great resource to check on materials. There are many advantages of green roofs. You can see the list here, and one perhaps of the most important is the increase in the efficiency of photovoltaics. In the United States, modular systems have become important, perhaps as a way of showing people who are skeptical that they work. It's almost like putting square flower pots cheek by jowl, and you can keep expanding the system. This is one at Silvercup Studios in Queens. This is a Con Edison or utility center in Long Island City in Queens. One advantage of the modular systems is you can grow them in a nursery and bring almost a fully whole system for installation. Sustainable design is an emphasis point for green roofs. It's basically design that nurtures itself. Another way of describing it is environmental design that enriches the human spirit by creating connections between nature and the built environment. And it's important to think in terms of both minimizing the negative environmental impacts while nourishing the human need to link with natural systems. In other parts of the United States and other parts of the world, green roofs are referred to as living roofs, like in London, eco roofs in Portland. Here's a London living roof, designed by Dusty Gedge, who started the green roofs movement there in Portland, Oregon. In Malmo, Sweden, they've developed what they call brown roofs on industrial sites. I mentioned photovoltaics. When photovoltaics are installed on green roofs, it increases the efficiency of the photovoltaics because the green roofs prevent the temperatures from being too hot or too cold, and that is within the ideal range in which the photovoltaics operate. This is, I believe, the convention center in Basel, Switzerland. You'll notice there's a continuous gravel strip around the perimeter of the roof. That's for maintenance and for ease of access. But you shouldn't think of green roofs as simply flat or sloping. At this hospital campus in Basel, Switzerland, Stefan Berniasen created this green roof system with sand pits and various elevation changes.
Stephen, I think we lost your audio.
I could still hear him.
Oh, okay.
Should I continue? Switching to a much smaller scale, this is a small garden, both the roof garden and the space between buildings in New York City, between historic row houses. It's maybe 50 feet square and then goes up several stories. It's a little hard to see from the plan view, but the idea is you come out onto a wood deck and then go across it in diagonal movements, which makes it seem larger. From above, you're pulled out through the architectural elements by the repetition of the rhythm of the steel frames and the flowering materials in the landscape. I think it's important in design to be pulled from different aesthetics. In music, Sonata Form has been around for hundreds of years. If you put it into English, the idea of exposition, development, recapitulation, coda. I didn't realize when I was writing the book on green roofs that that was pretty much the way I laid out the book. You sort of tell people what you're going to do, you do it, and then you go back and summarize it. And I think it's worth considering that as a design approach as well. When 9/11 struck New York, it devastated, of course, that area near Tribeca. I was fortunate as a musician to be able to put on a concert with a singer, but I commissioned a composer who's now in Denver, Colorado, to do a set of nocturnes. She called them 7 Nocturnal Transformations, Sarah Dawson, but she laid out what she thought was the process whereby people can react to a catastrophe. She put them in this order: naivete, compulsion, calamity, forbearance, succor, empathy, stability. I found almost 2 decades later that in dealing with the COVID-19 virus and pandemic here in New York City, which has been so devastating, that relearning these pieces, which last about 12 minutes, it's given me a sense of poise and calm in the face of the difficulties here in New York City. I thought you would be interested in 5 books that are really instrumental in design studies in New York and the United States. The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces by William White, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs, various editions of Site Planning by Kevin Lynch. I almost included Anatomy of a Park by Albert Rutledge, but it's more a traditional park rather than, say, open space in urban settings. William White mapped the uses of small streetscapes in urban areas throughout major cities in the United States. He notes the importance of numerous benches of variable heights and seating areas, and it's fascinating to what degree he enjoyed them. Rachel Carson was trained as a journalist and naturalist and focused on the seashore, but she dared to investigate the impact of pesticides on songbirds and ended up starting the environmental movement in the United States. Jane Jacobs fought against the bulldozing of urban renewal and focused on the vitality of old neighborhoods with diverse architecture. Kevin Lynch's books are almost considered the Bible of the art and science of arranging the physical environment, which evolves into landscape architecture. In America, we just lost John Lewis, who died a few weeks ago. He was a son of sharecroppers. He wanted so much to be a preacher that he first started out on their farm preaching to the chickens on their farm, but eventually partnered with the Reverend Martin Luther King to promote desegregation, civil rights, and voting rights and racial equality. He was arrested for nonviolent protest over 40 times. He died having established the importance of voting in a democracy. Getting back to public spaces in which John Lewis was so famous for protesting in, there's the Ground Zero Memorial Park, which the design for which was Michael Arad and landscape architect Peter Walker, on about 8 acres or about 2.5 hectares in Ground Zero. The 2 pools are each about 1 acre in size. I mentioned the importance of a park all year round. In winter, this site has a semi-abandoned look. There are no evergreen trees, for example. It's very windswept, so they're required to put up signs that the park cannot be used in the winter. The benches are simple slabs of stone, but quite uncomfortable. The tower by Daniel Libeskind is dominant, but the edges of bollards are very weak. I think it's not reinforced by planting. There's a beautiful grove of swamp white oaks, but the bollards hardly enforce the edge well. There's what's called a survivor tree, a calorie pear, that was brought back to health after surviving the attack. But it's a short-lived tree. I believe that they will use seedlings grown from seed from this tree when this tree dies. But it's the one blooming specimen on this entire park. There's a grid of rows of trees laid out, but the lines of the grid seem almost laid out at random. So you have the spectacular transportation hub, the Oculus by San Diego Calatrava, but the grid seems almost at random, so it doesn't line up to these elements. People lie around on the seating almost in a random way and very informally. So there's signs posted telling you how to behave. I think if a design has to remind people how to behave in it, it's not being very effective. By contrast, some of these green roof designs highlighted in the book are remarkable. The Oak Hammock Conservation Center near Winnipeg is a prairie restoration. When the grasses turn gold, the color of the stone used, so it blends in completely with the landscape. There are a lot of sustainable design features, for example, wetlands that filter all the waste. There's a nature museum in Chicago that has a series of different types of green roofs and a park around the perimeter. Robson Square in Vancouver is done by the architect Arthur Erickson and Cornelia Oberlander, landscape architect, who's nearing 100 years old. In contrast to Ground Zero Park, there's a simple palette of plant materials, both evergreen and deciduous. The edges are very strong. Some close off the city streetscape, others embrace it. You have sculpture and the upper left, they invented what they called stramps, which are a combination of ramps and steps. The alleys of trees are very well integrated into the rest of the design. They're hanging garden effects, and they seem to plan for the placement of future buildings, so it's very well integrated into the design. And spectacular water features that, although they're large, they don't seem to so dwarf the grandiose nature of the design. The California Academy of Sciences in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco was done by Renzo and Paul Kephardt. It was brought about after an earthquake made the existing buildings uninhabitable. So the green roof is like a floating magic carpet over this series of buildings that form the Science Museum. And the plants were tested in various settings before they came up with a group of 8 to colonize the green roof. There are various platforms from which you can see the green roof, which is accessible by elevator. Chicago has Millennium Park, which is a network of green roof designs built over the train yards, which used to separate parts of the city that are now linked. There's some spectacular sculptures, some of which have become quite iconic, like the Cloud Gate by Anish Kapoor, the Lurie Garden, which is a beautiful perennial garden of an hectare in size. There's a bridge by Renzo that links his new art museum over one of the roads to another part of the garden. There is a performing arts center by Frank Gehry. You've probably all heard about the High Line, which is a linear green roof connecting different parts of Manhattan to the northern part of the biggest private residential development in the city now. One advantage the High Line benefited from was that it was done in phases, so that when they observed any problems that occurred in phase 1, they could work to modify some of the details in subsequent phases. For example, in the lower right, you'll see that it's going at an angle to the grid. That created some awkward detailing of how to blend the planning into the pavement. When they reached the second and third phases, which you can see the second phase in construction at the top, they went along a route that was more linear and parallel to the street grid. That eliminated a lot of these awkward angles. The lower 2 images are the temporary artwork that was installed at the end point of the first phase. It has a magnificent array of diverse plant materials that have out. It's remarkable what diversity of both architecture, design, landscape, sculpture, and art has been installed. My only problem in using it is sometimes there's so many people who are enjoying it that it can get claustrophobic. Any number of architects have designed unusual buildings, including famous ones like Frank Gehry, and people wanting to make a splash with their first building, like this one at 23rd Street. The last project I wanted to show you is the Grange, which is an urban farm at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and a very active section of Brooklyn. It's used by the Navy still to maintain and service ships, but it's also used by many businesses, including Elizabeth Kennedy, who did the basic engineering and landscape calculations for it. It's on the top of a warehouse building. Sunflowers are used for their ability to filter out heavy metals. They also provide some windscreen because it's quite windy on top. It's a central location, about 5,600 square meters. They provide a lot of salad greens, honey, and other products. So in conclusion, what designers think about when planning a public space? You think about the size, the goals of the design, who's going to use it, what are the environmental conditions, and what is the budget? The environmental conditions, primarily, at first it's dealing with a lot of sun, wind, and what would you like to see in your own public space? Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Stephen. If you can stop sharing your screen so that Matthew can actually begin sharing his PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Stephen. That was very interesting. I like being, I particularly like the reminders of the books, Holly White and Jane Jacobs, Kevin Lynch, all on my bookshelf here. It's nice to go back to those sometime. And thank you very much for the cue into the start of my presentation. Let's see whether I can find that there. I'm not sure if I'm sharing that on full screen. Is that okay, Vicky?
Yes, looks good.
Excellent. And I've got, what, 20 minutes to run through this. Okay. Stephen very brilliantly introduced this to the idea of green roofs. What I would like to talk about this evening or this morning is a variation on this, which is the productive green roof. People taking a traditional roof and turning it into a site of production. And the image that you see here is in the middle of Causeway Bay in Hong Kong. And this is one of the densest urban districts in the world. The density within this particular photograph is something like 150,000 people. And yet, right in the middle of this very high rise, very high dense environment, there's a farm. Nobody can see it. It's up on the 38th floor. This is Tyson Place in Causeway Bay. And a few people go out every day and grow crops on this rooftop in a very unusual place. And it's not the only rooftop farm in Causeway Bay. There are two others. And I got very interested by this. I really saw this as an inspiration that despite the very sort of dense high-rise morphology of the city, there were still these moments of community investment in the fabric of the city, and that the people who were willing to go out and spend time and find spaces within this extraordinary urban structure to grow a few vegetables. Now, urban rooftop farming, and this is the segue that Stephen gave me. This is Brooklyn Grange in New York. Urban rooftop farming has been around for 15, 20 years and has been growing in popularity across the world. This is still probably the biggest large industrial building. This is probably the biggest urban rooftop farm in the world. But we will now find them in virtually every major city, every dense city around the world. They're all different. There's no standard model. There's no standard shape. They're all small scale, spontaneous, personal expressions within the city. And you can see that, that everybody within these gardens actively working at a very small scale These aren't big industrial or commercial operations. These are very much personal or community enterprise operations. And here's a few more from Southeast Asia and Europe. And you can see the scale and the texture and the nature of them is very tactile, very small scale, very personal, as I say. Even here in China, okay, it has Chinese characteristics of people growing rice on the roof, or what's that, lotus on the left. Still, the idea is the same across the world. People have identified these sort of grey roofs within our city as opportunities for going out and growing some vegetables or some fruit. Now, the benefits of rooftop farms are very similar to the benefits of green roofs. They have the sort of similar environmental benefits, lowering solar heat gain, improving energy conservation, air quality, urban biodiversity. Plus, they have a certain degree of social benefit, and the research done to date shows that, you know, they give opportunity to those parts of the population that don't have access to a private garden, which in Hong Kong is 99% of the population doesn't have a garden. Higher levels of active recreation, particularly amongst the older age groups, generally a healthier urban lifestyle, positive community engagement, and active stewardship of the roof spaces. People in urban rooftop farms are actually going out every day and looking at the rooftop, whereas the rooftop in other buildings tends to be out of sight, out of mind, and somewhat forgotten. And if there are problems, you don't tend to know about them very quickly. In a rooftop farm, people know about them straight away because they're out every day. And of course, the city authorities across the world see these and think, well, this is potential contribution to the urban environment, greening and sort of urban heat island effects. But the problem is that there is no clear definition. There's no performance criteria for rooftop farms that allow them to be formalized within the typical land use planning and building permit systems. So decision-making becomes difficult. For instance, in Hong Kong, urban rooftop farms are not recognized as green roofs within our sustainable building design guidelines, simply because government can't codify them. They can't write down a description of these rooftop farms. And so at the moment, they don't count for green building coverage. This is something that we're working actively to try and change. There is potential for commercial production, and they have been successfully commercialized, particularly in places like Singapore. But typically that's through the addition of rooftop glass houses or aquaponic structures, you know, growing the plants in water, hydroponic structures, aquaponics slightly different, vertical growing structures, etc., and tends to be limited to a very small number of crop species, such as the microgreens we see here. It's a very difficult environment, it's small scale, and the research tends to indicate that the potential for commercial production is very limited. Still, people are trying, people are interested, and there are a number of schemes getting ever more fanciful in terms of their structural form and the way that they operate in cities around the world. So I was very interested in this. And 8 years ago, I went out and built my own rooftop farm at the university in Hong Kong. And since then, I've been doing a number of research studies about rooftop farming in Hong Kong. The first was to do a basic survey, and then to evaluate the physical and participatory potential, how many people could be involved in rooftop farming. And then most recently, a study on the social benefits of rooftop farming. And I'll talk in detail about each of these. So we went out, 2014 this was, to identify rooftop farms. Now, most of them are out of sight, and most of the rooftop farmers are trying to stay out of sight. So they're quite difficult to find. But asking friends, asking building managers around the territory, we identified 60 urban rooftop farms that have been established by special interest groups, community enterprises, or private operations. The interesting thing about this is that none of them knew about any of the others. They were all individual expressions. They're all spontaneous. Wasn't part of a network, wasn't part of a movement. It was just a lot of people having the same good idea at the same time. And we did, within that survey, we looked at the building environment for the rooftop farms. And the photograph at the top is the Bank of America Tower. And this is a farm on the 39th floor. This is right in the middle of Central, one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in the world. On the 39th floor, the Bank of America Tower is a rooftop farm. This is 150 meters out of the ground. We were very interested in things like environmental data and the operational aspects that Stephen has touched on already today. And so we did a comprehensive survey, all the farms, all these different parameters. We really wanted to understand the conditions and things like roof drainage and waterproofing, exposure to winds. And of course, in Hong Kong, we have typhoons, a couple of typhoons every year. So we really wanted to understand the limits, the physical limits of the buildings and the farms itself. Plus, we wanted to understand the nature of the farm. What are they growing? How much are they producing? What sort of soil materials and planters, etc. And so we did a lot of interviews with farm managers. And we did a lot of interviews with the participants in the farm. I wrote out this long questionnaire trying to elicit data from the farmers, and then realized that most of them don't speak English. So I had to go and get that translated and conduct the questionnaire in Cantonese. But we were asking questions about their motivation, how often they went, how far from home, etc. Just to try and build up an understanding. I show you, I hope this video works, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. This is a project called Project Grow in a urban industrial district. This is a industrial building, former warehousing building in the district of Kwun Tong on the east side of Hong Kong. A big industrial building, flat roof plate. And there a small group of people have just stepped out onto the roof and started farming. And they create their own planters and they carry all the soil up and they decide what to grow in these planters. And they go out every day and water it and weed it and love it. And this is very much an expression of these people. It's their thing, it's their personalization in a city which doesn't really allow for personalization of external space. And if you go and talk to any of these people, they're blissfully happy to have this opportunity to engage with the landscape, to have some authority, some license to do their own thing outside, where everything else is managed centrally for them. And we can see in this image that how that farm, that tiny farm, relates to the urban form, very similar to the first farm that we looked at. We did a survey, as I said. We looked at whether they were open to the public, whether they were restricted to a limited group, such as a corporate building might just limit access to the people who rent the building. All sorts of different types of building, residential, industrial, institutional buildings and commercial buildings. So it seemed like virtually any building type was suitable. Plus, most of the buildings were new buildings, i.e. within 40 years, 45 years. And that became a significant point. We did a typological study to try and identify patterns within that. I won't trouble you with that, that's been published. A typological study. And of course, we set up a website that you can go and have a look at. That's the rather complicated URL at the bottom, but all the images, all the aerial drone camera footage, and all the statistics that we generated through that study, we put on a website, and we gave it back to the farming community and said, here, use this for your own promotion, use this as a collaborative resource to help yourself and help you develop your interests. The second study we did was to ask the question of, well, how far could we push this? There seemed to be an awful lot of interest in rooftop farms. So what was the physical capacity? If we looked at all the roofs in Hong Kong, how many of them could we grow farms on? And what is the participatory capacity? How many people might be interested in rooftop farming in Hong Kong. So we needed to do a basic survey, but this time we did a survey of all the buildings in Hong Kong. We have the big data sets up at the university, and we look at the different types of buildings and the different location, different types of roof structure, etc., and made estimations on how many roof types there were and which were going to be suitable, what percentage of each roof was going to be potentially usable. Obviously, you need to get access to the edge, to the parapet edge. There's quite a lot of equipment on the roof, telecommunications, fire services, equipment, etc., that needs access space for maintenance and repairs. And we also needed to look at the structural capacity of the roof deck. Now, the age of the building gives a very strong indication here that all buildings in Hong Kong after about 1980 have been designed with a flat roof, because in a high-rise city, when there is a fire in the building and you're in the upper half of the building, you go up, you escape to the roof rather than escape to the ground. So the roof deck has to have very strong slab and is able to support quite a lot of weight. So that means there is a lot of spare capacity in terms of the structural loading on the roof, which allows us to put in these rooftop farms. We looked at environmental conditions, particularly exposure to sunlight and strong winds. We didn't find any problem with that. The 8 or 9 years that my rooftop farm has been going, we've had maybe 15, 18 typhoons. We haven't lost a single structure within that farm during that time. And some of them have been equivalent to, say, Category 4 hurricanes. So these are very, very durable structures, and they're designed in a very interesting way too. All those planters are connected together, so they become a mass weight anchor. We also looked at things like the presence of insect pollinators. If you're trying to grow your tomatoes, you need some bees to fertilize your flowers. How do the bees know that there is a farm up there? Particularly that one that I showed you that was 150 meters out of the ground in the middle of one of the most dense parts of the planet. How do the bees find their way there? We don't know the answer to that question, but we do know that the bees find their way there. They are capable of finding their way there, and I particularly grow flowers to allow them to go there, or to encourage them up onto the farms. Excuse me a second. But there doesn't seem to be any problem in terms of the environmental condition. We worked out a simple calculation on the building types and all those factors I've just mentioned, that there is something in the order of 600 hectares of farmable roof space in the middle of Hong Kong. If we ever run out of food, this is going to be a tremendous resource. But the key aspect to this is that it's in the middle of Hong Kong. It's very close to the people and provides an excellent resource for social recreation and sort of these external environment projects that people seem to be so interested in. When we looked at the participatory capacity, we asked all the farms, how many people came, how many people wanted to come. They're all heavily oversubscribed, something like 40 to 1, 40 people wanting to go for one space available within the farm. And they've all got almost unlimited space to expand. The only issue for them is uncertainty over the legal status of rooftop farming. It's one of these very curious things is that even though Hong Kong is heavily regulated, lots of rules and regulations, lots of code, there's no code about the use of rooftops for farming. And when I went to speak to the lands department and then I went to speak to the buildings department, they gave me a very typical Hong Kong answer, which is, we don't know, but please don't ask. If you ask, we're going to have to say no, because that's what we're meant to say. But if you don't ask, then we don't have to say anything, so you can carry on. So these guys exist in this sort of wonderful state of ambiguity, and across the world in cities, a lot of the most interesting things happen in moments of ambiguity, at the edge, at the margins. where the rules aren't terribly clear or the ownership isn't very clear. And this is one of a fine example of this. Nobody knows whether this is legal or not. These guys just go out, possession being 9/10 of the law, and they start farming. And of course, it would be very difficult for anybody to go and ask them to take it away, because that would be politically quite a challenge. Nobody wants to see such a beautiful thing being destroyed just for rules and regulations. We looked at the demographics, young people, some middle-aged, but mainly retired people. Very interesting. We looked at the organizational structures. This is my own farm at Hong Kong U from the upper deck. And you can see some of the rules and regulations that we set for ourselves. Everything within my farm has either been donated by somebody or has been stolen, and usually by me. It's my job in the farm is to go and steal things like soil and planters and benches and everything else, or we make it. I made the table you can see on the right-hand side out of surplus material from the architectural studios. And of course, there are lots of different operational models, different ways of doing it, whether it's private organization, whether it's subscription, whether it's a social enterprise, but all of them have the same sort of joy and enthusiasm and encounter with nature, this sort of interaction with local schools and local communities. It's a fabulous thing to see. There again, another photograph from my farm. When we asked the farmers what their motivations were, they said, well, basically, we just want to meet other people. We want the pleasure of growing things. We want an opportunity for this sort of passive recreation. We like to learn things. And expertise was not a limiting factor. I've yet to come across a rooftop farmer who claims to know what they're doing. They all claim to be very happy about it and they all have fun, but none of them claim to be experts in rooftop farming. And I think that is a telling point as well. Based on the current participation rates, total roof area available, there should be capacity for at least 18,000 people to engage in rooftop farming. And it could be 10 times higher if we can get government to support it and government to make access available to some of their buildings as well. The third study we did was really about the social benefits. We were very interested in this statement that we do it for social reasons. And so we did a second questionnaire survey in a particular district, worked with one of my thesis students on this, really asking the question, why do you do it? What is your motivation? And we broke down the social benefits that people have been talking about into 6 different categories to try and understand. And you can see the various ways that we're describing those sort of benefits, whether they're health related, education, community related, or whether they were interested in things like urban improvement or social empowerment. And we were asking questions about how far people were traveling and how much they're willing to pay to engage in rooftop farming. And we asked both farmers and non-farmers. We found out that the willingness to pay was quite high. The Hong Kong dollars, 8 Hong Kong dollars to $1 US, just over. So you can see that's a monthly bill, just under so 27, 28 US dollars. People are willing to pay for the privilege of having a little bit of space to grow some tomatoes in. Obviously, it's far cheaper just to go to the supermarket and buy your tomatoes. So it's not about food production. And we looked at cost-benefit analysis as well. Looked at payback times if you wanted to set up a rooftop farm. And the usual payback time for a subscription farm is less than 3 years. So there's a very strong economic argument for rooftop farms as well. And we developed, this is published in a paper I'll show you in a minute. We developed this rather complicated chart to plot the responses on why do you do it? What are the social benefits? The principal benefits people are talking about are personal health, personal education, personal recreation. They recognize but are not so interested in urban social improvement, urban improvement, improving the urban environment, social empowerment, bringing the community together, or social group interaction. These were of lesser importance to the farmers. What they were really after was these personal things. This is the paper that we've just published on the social value of urban rooftop farming. And the conclusions of the study were that the social benefits are far more important than the ecological or the built environment or the productive benefits. One of the really interesting findings was that rooftop farms do not produce any food. If you look at their total output, it's eaten by the farmers. They never really produce more than they can eat. One or two of the farms, like Brooklyn Grange do, but most rooftop farms, all the produce is eaten by the farmers. But what they do produce is enormous amounts of happiness. The people you encounter on rooftop farms are blissfully happy. They will show you the 3 small tomatoes that they have grown over the last 2 months. And they will talk to you about these for a couple of hours with sort of great smiles on their face. It's just fabulous to see people so engaged. These 3 small tomatoes will have their own Facebook page. I mean, it's got to that level. People are really, really engaged with this. There's a huge demand for it. The social benefits are multifaceted. There's lots of different sides to it. But ultimately, it comes down to happiness. And this happiness is generated out of these sort of ambiguous roof spaces. And I think that has got a very important aspect to it in terms of how we look at the planning and the design and the management of cities. And the thing that we've been doing since this paper is talking to government about reconceiving the idea, reconceiving the product of rooftop farming, not as tomatoes, not as produce, but as happiness, as social happiness. And we feel that this is a potentially a very big thing. If we can bring the farms together, if we can legitimize them, if we can codify them, and we can take advantage of all these roof spaces that are available, many different types of building, many different physical environmental situations, they're not limited. If we can take advantage of all of this, there is a lot of potential advantages to the city. We're maximizing the use of space in the city, and of course in Hong Kong, ground level space is highly contested, as you might imagine. We're promoting healthy urban lifestyles, we're certainly promoting community engagement, and we're really tying into things like aging in place. Allowing people to get old in high-rise buildings is a big challenge within many modern cities. How do old people cope within the city? And as the city densifies, and space for recreation and, this third place idea becomes ever more restricted, the roof offers a particular opportunity. This is my favorite rooftop farm, which is, I'll end here. This is the Caritas Locan School in Tin Sua Wai, which is in the northwest New Territories of Hong Kong. And this is a school for disabled kids. It's quite a low-rise school. It's only 5 stories, but it has a very, very big roof deck, and it has a wonderful principal who had this idea of developing a rooftop farm. Now, these are very special disabled kids. They are both physically and mentally handicapped. So they're very, very disadvantaged, and they can do, physically, they can do virtually nothing. But he had this wonderful idea of building this rooftop farm, and the kids go up every afternoon in their wheelchairs and sit and watch the teachers and the farmers just, plant seedlings and grow and water and prune and all the other things, and get to talk and get to engage and get to experience. And everybody who goes there sort of ends up in tears because it's such a powerful thing. And one of the great aspects of this is that within Chinese society, and I'm not being particular about this, but within the local society here, disability is a very difficult, very challenging idea, and something that society sort of steps back from. And to have a disabled school next to you is a very challenging thing. It might affect your property value. But after they had developed this rooftop farm and all the high-rise buildings around could see down into this farm, people from the neighboring buildings started coming to the school and saying, that's very interesting. Do you need any help? Can we help in your farm? And now they have dozens and dozens of helpers from the surrounding residential buildings coming and helping every afternoon to grow their vegetables. And of course, through that, they engage with these disabled students, these young kids who are severely disadvantaged, breaking down this barrier, breaking down this prejudice about disability in society. And I think this is just a blessed example of how something as simple as just putting a few plants on the roof can really just change attitude in society.
Thank you, Matthew.
So, yeah, just a few more summary points there that you can read. I'll leave these slides with Vicky so you can have a look at that, and then we go back to the original. Okay, thank you very much, Vicky, for allowing me to go on for so long.
Well, thank you, Matthew. It was really, really awesome to have you shared how people actually are farming for happiness. And this is really a very insightful research. So we're going to try something new for our Q&A section. Typically, you can actually type your questions in the Q&A. We wanted to have people be able to talk to our speakers from New York and also in Hong Kong. So for people who are asking, who have actually asked us questions, we're going to unmute you and let you actually ask our speakers a question directly, if you don't mind. Claire, can you actually go down the list? The first question is coming from Komal.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Yes, I just wanted to ask about the drainage systems involved in these roof gardens, because obviously the building is made first and then the roof garden is installed. So how do you incorporate the drainage system in an already constructed building? Thank you.
Stephen, do you want to have a go at that, or you want me to have a go?
I can try to respond and then you can add.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, and I think Hong Kong must have more stringent requirements for buildings than New York City, in that we actually have a lot of buildings that don't meet the criteria that they can support a lot of weight. So if you're dealing with an existing building, the first thing you would do is hire an engineer to verify what the structural capacity of the roof is. And if it meets certain minimum standards, you're lucky, because a lot of older buildings in New York City don't comply with the modern code, and you would have to expose the system of beams and joists that are steel and add more steel to generate more strength, which is very, very expensive. So that's why extensive green roofs, which can't really support much weight in the way of people, are more popular. If you're going to do something like the food gardens that Matthew was showing, you would probably likely get into very expensive steel reinforcing in a lot of New York City buildings, because many of the existing buildings don't have the adequate capacity to add a lot of additional weight on the building. Newer buildings do, but you would start by doing a study of the roof itself to see if it had the adequate structural capacity to support the weight that would be involved.
Yeah, maybe I can supplement there. Structural capacity is a key consideration, and we spend a lot of time sort of weighing our planters and everything else just to understand the weight of it. Your question was about drainage, and I'm going to tie drainage into waterproofing. one of the key considerations for building management is the waterproofing system. If you're retrofitting rooftop farm into an existing building, and nearly all of them are, except for that photograph I started with, which was actually designed in. But if you're retrofitting them, the design of the rooftop farm has to start from the existing waterproofing layer or roof surface and work up. You cannot dig down, you can't bolt them down. That's why we're having to use the weight of the planters as anchors. And what we actually do is we lay down a strip of high density polyethylene and then put the planters on top so that we don't run the risk of damaging the waterproofing layer. Because you're building up, then you're not really going to affect the drainage. The roof deck must drain anyway. As long as you're not interrupting or blocking the drains, as long as you're not allowing leaves, etc., to block up the drains, it should not be a problem.
Thank you. Claire, can you unmute Rex? Rex Wong is our past president. He has interesting questions about PV panels and green roof in Hong Kong.
I'm losing the audio somehow. Could you repeat that?
Oh, Claire, can you unmute Rex?
I've already unmuted Rex. Rex, can you speak? Rex?
Yes, hello. Hi.
Hi.
Rex, hi.
Hi. Yes, thanks for the sharing. The question I have is, as mentioned by the two speakers, the roof areas in Hong Kong are typically very small already because of the density of the building and city. And these days in Hong Kong, there's a big push by the government and the local utilities for citizens to adopt renewable energy. And one of the means is the photovoltaic panels, which typically are installed on the roof. So the question I have really just wondering how the two speakers feel about the opportunity and the challenge of having these renewable energy installation working with the various green roof ideas.
Well, I think Stephen showed an interesting example of where they can coexist. If the photovoltaic panels can be elevated above the roof, you still have space for planting underneath. And that was certainly an idea that was proposed for the West Kowloon Cultural District buildings, some of the later buildings, to have a two-level roof. Of course, photovoltaics can wrap around the vertical surface of the building as well. So there's a general thought about how can we make the surfaces of buildings more productive in terms of energy, or productive in terms of food production, or carbon sequestration, or mitigating urban heat island. I think it's a very interesting question, right? I think it's going to become competitive. People are seeing these potentials in roof spaces, and going forwards in the next 5 years, we're going to have to be developing hybrid systems that will allow us to maximize the productive capacity and the diversity of production on the roof. Stephen, any thoughts?
I think when my book came out in 2008, you couldn't buy a complete green roof system from one manufacturer. You had to get different components from different suppliers. And in a relatively short period of time, every manufacturer now has their own complete package. And I think it's now a matter that everything has become much more competitive because the demand is there. And the cost of a green roof by any particular manufacturer, or the cost of photovoltaics, has come down because it's a much more competitive product and the demand is greater. So I think there will be increasing levels of innovation, and there will be a greater array of products available, and that is probably going to continue. I think the photovoltaics are a good example that they're much more widely available and they're more efficient than they used to be.
Okay, shall we move on? Have a question here. How do you choose plants considering typhoons? Very, very interesting question. Okay, I think we all have to think about our plant selection with respect to extreme weather conditions. As I say, within my rooftop farm, we've been through 15, 20 typhoons over the years. We've never had a problem. The damage comes when you have big woody plants that can break in typhoons. If you're growing something like sweet potatoes or something, they just get flattened back to the soil and they will grow back again very quickly because they're very flexible. We also can do some protective work in anticipation for a typhoon. We know it's coming 1 or 2 days in advance. We will go and take out structures and lay things down. You know, if you've got some peas or something, you can lay those down, you can peg those down. And of course, if it's really severe, you can pick it up and move it indoors. I've known people pick up whole farms and move them indoors. But that seems like a lot of effort to me.
I would add to that you have to be very alert to the weather forecasting and hope that it's accurate. And I'm here in New York City. We had a borderline hurricane tropical storm strike just 4 or 5 days ago. I'm in charge of the landscaping at our building, and that includes 7 trees that are in at-grade planters that are about that are relatively small, but the trees have grown to about 3 stories in height, and 3 of them were completely blown over by the wind, which reached about 70 miles an hour. That would be maybe 100 kilometers an hour. And I fortunately had specified river birch. River birch is fast growing, it's durable. The wood is very pliant and supple, so nothing snapped off. And fortunately, the trees blew down parallel to the building rather than perpendicular, so there was no damage to the building. When they were re-erected, they recovered very quickly. I think what we would have to do in the future, if a storm is forecast, we would have to bolt them to adjacent retaining walls to hold them erect so that they would not blow over again. What generally you have to do is, in advance of a storm, take precautions, remove furniture that is going to potentially blow away, umbrellas, things like that. But just as Matthew was saying, you want to deal with plant materials that can rejuvenate quickly, and you have to be very careful of trees or shrubs that could blow off and damage or injure people. I'm unfortunately at a disadvantage. The bottom part of my screen has disappeared, so I can't read questions or chats.
Okay, well, the next question is for you, Stephen. It says, where can we find your books?
My book is from Oxford University Press, so you could order it at their website, which is oup.com. You could also order it through amazon.com.
Excellent stuff. And you mentioned 2 books, is that right?
Yes, the other book, I think you could just Google the title, which was Green Roofs and Sustainable Landscape Design. And I know it would be available on a lot of different websites.
Okay, and I'm sure Stephen's willing to offer a discount if you can get to his apartment on that. Okay, thank you. Vicky, I'm so sorry I'm taking your job here. I hope you don't mind.
Right towards the end of your lecture, the bottom quarter of my screen just stopped. It's blank.
Oh, yeah, you haven't paid the rent. It's a problem.
Yes, I have your face hold though, which is good. your nice smile.
Enough. I've got a question from Caroline. Oh, this one's for me. Have roof gardens been beneficial for people with disabilities? Yes. But it's usually a mental benefit. They're very soothing, they're very calming, they're very social. And within therapeutic gardens, you know, the design of therapeutic gardens, that aspect of touching nature and, you know, relaxing and generally just being sort of having that encounter with the real natural world tends to be very restorative, very calming. And of course, if it's social as it is on the rooftop farms, that has a great sort of supporting effect. And a lot of people find it to be a very powerful refuge from the city. Hong Kong has very unusual health metrics. The physical health in Hong Kong is amongst the best in the world. You know, our life expectancy is almost the highest in the world. Physically very good, mentally very poor. Our mental health metrics are very poor, ranging from neurosis right through to things like teen suicide. Living in a high-rise, high-dense city where you can't get away from anybody else, you know, it's a big challenge. And certainly the people we speak to say that, you know, being able to get out on the roof and getting away from people, getting away from the street is very important to them.
I do have a question about roof and landscape design. You know, Stephen mentioned about green roof and brown roof, and you know, Mathew mentioned about urban farming on the roof. Like, are there any other new idea that are up and coming about newer way to use rooftop and newer ways to utilize the roofscape in an urban setting?
Well, it's not that new anymore, but there's also what are called living walls, which is a newer invention, but it's basically applying the green roof technology to the vertical surfaces. And there's some spectacular results that are well worth investigating. So that if instead of dealing with a roof, you're dealing with a wall or an almost vertical surface, you get some very attractive and aesthetic benefits.
I'm very interested in this extension of the surfaces within the city that we now think of as sites for landscape architecture. Used to be just the ground, then the podium deck, now the roof deck, now the building facades. All of it is site for landscape architecture. But to answer your question, Vicky, the green roofs that Stephen was talking about have many benefits, you know, other than being, you know, sort of insulating or, you know, sort of mitigating urban heat island. You've got all the urban biodiversity stuff. You've got the sort of the sponge city effect, you know, the water mediating the sort of heavy rainstorms. You've got carbon sequestration. All of these things are benefits. If you add in also my social stuff about, you know, the sort of community engagement and social empowerment and all the rest of it, that's already a lot of potential product on the roof. And then, as Rex was saying, you've got opportunities for generating power, etc. So these are sites of great interest now. And I think it's going to be difficult for us in the future as landscape architects. You know, we're going to get a lot of competition up there, people wanting to do different things up on the roof.
Thank you.
I have one question for you, Mathew. Hong Kong has a lot of regulations for green roofs.
Yes,
would it be an advantage or disadvantage if the urban farming were subsumed into the category of green roofs? Would that help or hurt it?
But it would be a challenge. It would be difficult. It would create more work. But I think ultimately legitimizing it within the land use planning and building processes would be a great advantage. And that is commonly cited as the main reason why it's not more widespread at the moment. People don't know, people are not sure, particularly the building owners, who tend to be very conservative people. They want to see the regulation. What we need is good regulation, positive regulation. And I think if we look at the government's program in Hong Kong for adding green roofs to schools, there are now something like 400 schools in Hong Kong that have green roofs. That, I think, is a positive example of how we should codify and regulate urban rooftop farms.
Matthew, there's 2 more questions. If we can go down the list, and probably we can wrap up for tonight.
Okay. So this question about ambiguity. How can the ambiguity that makes the strength of urban rooftop farms in Hong Kong be preserved while being incorporated into? I had no idea. In the broader context of the city, I think people like myself are beginning to talk and write about this idea of ambiguity, you know, the hybridity, the indeterminacy of the city, the fact that, you know, it's heterogeneous. It's not all the same thing. It can't be regulated. It can't be put into a formula. And for the health of the city, we need to allow for personalization and flexibility and adaptation, appropriation, and all of these things. I think the long-term benefit is that urban planners and designers and city regulators are beginning to understand this and beginning to allow for adaptation and appropriation. The danger, as we've just hinted at, is that if you go at it too quickly, you end up with very restrictive regulations, and that effectively kills everything. And that's effectively what has happened with things like ground level urban farming in Hong Kong or organic farming in Hong Kong. You know, people's desire to put limits around it kills the enthusiasm of people who want to engage in it. So these things need to be sort of handled very sensitively. Stephen, I don't know whether you have different experiences in New York.
I think it's a challenge in New York because, well, it must be like Hong Kong in the sense that property values are so outrageously high, but it might be somewhat like community gardens. Mm-hmm. Community gardens took a long time to get protected legally, and there's some that are protected legally, and therefore they're almost like an institution. Everyone knows that they can participate there. There are clear regulations and organizational frameworks that protect them and allow them to go on year after year. But then there are ones that get created ad hoc that might even be nicer than some of the ones that are part of the planning process. And it's how you go about getting the ones that spring up on a vacant lot or an abandoned property and seem wonderfully successful and beautiful, but are not protected legally. How do you get those accepted? And it's a very rough and dirty process, and some gain the ear of a city council person or a politician or someone who has enough clout to get them over the hump, and others don't. And one day people show up and it's been bulldozed and a building is under construction. And it's just the nature of the difficulties of city living. At the same time, I think the whole notion of ambiguity is important. You can't write a specification for exactly everything that has to happen. It's better to almost think of it as a performance type specification. Do what they did and leave it open-ended so there's plenty of creativity by the group that's involved to do what they feel is best.
just one short footnote to that. I always look at who thinks they own this space. Who believes that this is their space? Who is willing to take responsibility for it? And that's where you get these guys who are willing to climb over the fence to plant a few vegetables. They're the guys who are willing to look after it. The city regulator, the city cleaning authorities and everything, they're just paid to be there. But the guys that you know, feel it's their space, feel responsible for it, these are the ones that we need to work through. Okay, let's move on. Because the last question, and this is a question for you, Stephen. What would a pre-planned green roof cost versus a new building without a planned green roof?
That I'm afraid I couldn't give you a good answer to. When my book was written in 2008, there is a chart inside giving rough costs, but they've changed dramatically. Also in Hong Kong, I would have no way of comparing between there and here. Generally speaking, green roofs can cost significantly more than a conventional roof on a building, which is why they're not standardly built now in new construction. But they become much more competitive. And if you're interested in pursuing it for either a new building or a adaptation to an existing building, you should just contact some of the green roof manufacturers, get some contractors' names, and get some ballpark figures. My book has an extensive appendix which lists 20 or 30 green roof manufacturers, most of whom are still quite active on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think if you checked websites, you would be able to get some pretty good ideas of prices.
Great minds. I'm going to mention my book right at the end because it has exactly the same data for Hong Kong. There's tables at the back with some estimate of costs for various materials and structures relating to rooftop farms. Two quick things I would add to that. The material cost is usually less than half the total cost. It's not really about the material, it's about things like access. Can you get access to your roof? You know, my rooftop farm, we have something like 10 metric tons of soil on that roof, and it has to be hand carried from the ground up to the roof. We can't get access. If we wanted to, we'd have to build a sort of tower crane or something to get up there. So we just carry it by hand. That is a cost that's very difficult to quantify. So access and the operational side of construction is very difficult. The other thing I would say, the other point I'd make, is that retrofitting is often a lot cheaper than designing it in. When you design it in, you tend to add lots of things, you know, extra deep soil, you tend to have sort of comprehensive drainage systems and everything else. Whereas the retrofit ones, my rooftop farm costs nothing because we stole most of it, did all the work ourselves as volunteers. Because we're not too fussy about standards, because anything we'll do as a planter, you know, we can produce our own soil through composting, etc. Actually, it's surprisingly cheap. And we have this ambition to have zero cost. It's a zero escape for us. So from that aspect.
That sounds like a wonderful book you've done. I would really like, where can you get your book?
I know it's on sale here in Hong Kong. Otherwise, you have to write to me and get a copy from me. I can send it out. Yes. It's very cheap. It's a very cheap book.
One thing I would say about my Green Roof book, even though it was published in 2008, there are case studies of about 40 or 50 projects. And with each one, you find out what the substrate was, what the type of green roof. It gives you a complete plant list of all the plants that we use. It talks about what problems, if anything, occurred with it. So it would give you a great deal of information on the style, the type of roof, the size, what the purpose of it was, so that if you're anticipating a green roof of whatever type or size, it would give you a great deal of information to sift through. I think it would be a useful resource.
All right. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Matthew. It has been a really great evening. Well, for everyone in the audience, if you're interested in the academic research that Stephen and Matthew has put together, the books is underneath the bio. If you look back at the email that we sent you, you can actually see the name of the book, and then you'll probably find the books just by Googling the names. And I'm just going to do a little bit more advertising on AIA Hong Kong. So for the next webinar that we have, we will be talking about Lantau Tomorrow Vision on next Tuesday. One of our speakers, Tom Yen, will be talking about the pro and con to do one of the biggest reclamation project here in Hong Kong, in the middle of our harbor. So we will talk about land policy and all the environmental issues and concerns that comes with this project. And if you look at the background on my screen, the Hong Kong AIA Hong Kong Honor and Award will be closing in 2 weeks. So if you are an architect or designers wanting to submit your award, you have 2 more weeks. Prepare your board, and then we welcome everyone to submit to our competition. So thank you again. And this webinar will be recorded and we'll be posting it on YouTube. So if you miss it, we'll send it out to all the members around the world again. Well, thank you again, Matthew and Stephen. So,
Vicky, thank you so much. Okay.
Great opportunity to learn from both of you.
Thank you. Juliana.
Thank you very much. It was a great privilege to participate.
Bye-bye.